عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. First of all, I'd like to give you my apologies for being an hour late today. So I really apologize for this unintended delay. Inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is our 8th lecture of this course. So what we'll be doing, inshallah, is covering the last 2 sections that we have left in this particular book that we have been reading together, the Book of Knowledge of Ihya Ulumuddin, the Revival of Religious Knowledge. These 2 remaining parts of the Book of Knowledge discuss 2 topics. The 6th section discusses the idea of afatul ilm. Afatul ilm, the word afa, is pretty much something that is a risk of something beneficial. And this is something that many scholars do talk about, that there is no benefit, there is no good in this earth, or on this earth, or in this life, that does not contain, or include, or entail some kind of a risk. If the person is not attentive to these risks, these sort of risks turn whatever benefit, whatever good, whatever useful, whatever beneficial, turns these good things into negative issues. So again, anything that is positive is usually is accompanied by some kind of a risk. If that risk, the person is not attentive to it and falls in such pitfalls or falls in such negative issues, whatever useful, whatever productive, whatever beneficial act or ritual or process or objective he was trying to attain or she was trying to attain, these sort of things turn into negative issues, turn into harmful problems, turn into things that would inflict harm and actually the opposite of being useful. Okay? Some of these things are like worship, some of these things are like seeking knowledge, for example. So when the person is seeking knowledge, this is something beneficial. Yet, seeking knowledge is accompanied by risks, by challenges. Some of these challenges are being seeking knowledge for the sake of popularity, for the sake of being a celebrity, for the sake of acquiring worldly life, for the sake of using knowledge as a commodity. So the person would sell knowledge to gain money, to gain wealth, to gain position, to gain anything of these sorts. So this is a risk, that the person would use the knowledge that he or she are seeking for the sake of this life, not the afterlife. So this section, Imam Al-Ghazali radiallahu ta'ala anhu discusses this issue of afatul ilm. And he also talks about the description or the characteristics or the traits or the attributes of the scholars of al-akhirah, as he calls them, and the scholars of ad-dunya. So he gives certain indications, certain hallmarks, benchmarks if you want to call them, and what the student of knowledge is supposed to do and what the scholar is supposed to do as well is to watch out for these conditions, the conditions of being a scholar of al-akhirah, of the day of judgment. Imam Al-Ghazali starts this section by saying that the ulama us-su, and we talked about this issue of ulama us-su, the scholars who are blameworthy, the blameworthy scholars. He said that there are texts or narrations or nusus, verses and ahadith of the revelation that contain severe and extreme warnings against the concept of blameworthy knowledge or blameworthy scholars. Imam Al-Ghazali starts by mentioning the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ in this section, and then he moves on to the narrations of the companions and the pious predecessors. And I believe that many of these hadith, some of you are already familiar with all of them or many of them. And the very famous narration in this regard that amongst those who are the very first that be punished by hellfire is the person who studied knowledge, who sought knowledge, who was seeking to be a scholar, not for the sake of acts, not for the sake of worship, not for the sake of application of this knowledge, not for the sake of implementing this knowledge, but rather for the sake of being popular, being seen as a scholar, being seen as a professor, being seen as somebody who has fame. All right. So this is the hadith in this regard are very popular. And he also talked about how the person who seeks knowledge for the sake of popularity, for example, or for the sake of being a celebrity, and actually not only that, but the person who seeks knowledge not for the aim, not for the objective of applying this knowledge, but rather just for the accumulation, for as if it's a desire, it's a shahwa, just to gain more knowledge, to accumulate knowledge, not to seek the application of that knowledge, putting that knowledge into practice, putting that knowledge into an activity, not to live according to that knowledge. So that person, he says, Imam Al-Ghazali, that the punishment for that person is doubled. Because not only that he did not act, but he actually had the necessary knowledge that would urge him, that would push him, that would allow him to act correctly, and yet that person did not act accordingly. For that reason, knowledge becomes a reason that it's a double edge. It would turn against the person. He says, وَإِنَّمَا يُضَاعَفُ عَذَابُ الْعَالِمِ فِي مَعْصِيَتِهِ. Yudha'af is double. And one might say multiplied. So it's not necessarily yudha'af as multiplied by 2. It could be multiplied by more than 2, more than twice. And he says, لِأَنَّهُ عَصَى عَنْ عِلْمٍ. Because he has committed a sin, even though he has the necessary knowledge, the necessary tools for not to fall into such sin. And then he concludes the intro of this section by saying that all the athar, all the narrations that have been mentioned do explain and do illustrate that the scholar who is what he calls from abna'u dunya, from those scholars who are seeking knowledge for the sake of this dunya, أخسر حالا وأشد عذابا من الجاهل. That those actually do get punishment and their losses are so much great than those who are actually ignorant. So the person who seeks knowledge for the wrong purpose is pretty much in the view of Imam Al-Ghazali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and all the Sufi scholars as well, is worse than the person who is just ignorant and perhaps falling into sins because he's unaware, he has not been told, he has not been informed, he did not learn about these issues. That person is much better, not necessarily is a good thing, but is much better than the person who has all the necessary tools for not committing a sin, and yet he does fall into these things. And then he moves from this particular area of afatul ilm that we just mentioned into what he calls al-alamat. Al-alamat is pretty much indications or indicators of whom? Of those who seek knowledge for the sake of al-akhirah. And he says that the bare minimum of being a scholar of al-akhirah, that the person seeks knowledge not for the dunya. This is the bare minimum. Okay, the minimum requirement for the person to become one of ulama al-akhirah is that he does not seek knowledge for the sake of dunya at all. And he says that also the bare minimum of that knowledge is to notice, to be aware of the fact that this dunya that we live in is, in comparison to al-akhirah, is pretty much nothing. It's worthless. So if a scholar is not aware of does not notice, does not live up to the idea of that this life, in comparison to the Day of Judgment, in comparison to paradise, in comparison to hellfire, is worthless. And not only that, he says that the scholar of Akhirah always sees that the Day of Judgment, always sees that the hereafter, always sees Al-Akhirah in comparison to Al-Dunya as opposites. He does not find an equilibrium between Al-Akhirah and Al-Dunya. He does not find an equilibrium between both of them. He does not find that both of them are on the same level. But rather, they are opposites. To the point that these two opposites are never together. In other words, if your dunya, in other words, if the person treats a dunya as something that he is compassionate about, is worried about a dunya, automatically has to know that he is not worried about al-akhirah. If you're worried about al-dunya, you're not worried about al-akhirah. If you're working for dunya, you're not working for al-akhirah. And vice versa. If you work for al-akhirah, you're not working for al-dunya. Okay? So these are sort of intrinsic qualities in both of them, that they are never together. They cannot be accompanied. You cannot reach a state, as I said, a state of equilibrium, where you are satisfying a dunya and at the same time you're satisfying al-akhirah. It can never work that way. Alright? Okay. And then he says something really, really interesting. He says that don't you think that leaving money, being away from money, not caring about money, is enough for you to become one of the ulama al-akhirah, the scholars of the Day of Judgment. To be a scholar of the Day of Judgment, it is not enough that you don't care about money, which is really interesting. Because some people think that if I'm not caring about money and I'm just spreading knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and I don't get any financial reward out of it, so that would make me one of the scholars of Al-Akhirah. Imam Al-Ghazali says, don't think that this is enough. But rather, he says, فَإِنَّ الْجَاهَ أَضَرُّ مِنَ الْمَالِ. Popularity, fame, being a celebrity is much, much harmful than getting money because you teach or you spread knowledge by any kind of means. Seeking fame, seeking being vanity, being a celebrity, being pointed at, being famous, is much worse than taking money. So he says, don't think that taking money, by not taking money, you become automatically a scholar of al-akhirah. And this is something that he has indicated in the beginning of Bidayatul Hidayah. The problem, the great problem in seeking knowledge, or the great risk in seeking knowledge, that the person gains some kind of social authority on people. And the social authority is very luring. People tend to be lured by having an authority, by being in a position where people obey, where people listen, where people respect, when a person gets a privilege, gets a title. All of these things, Imam Al-Ghazali sees, are much more dangerous on the seeker of knowledge than getting some kind of a financial reward out of his studies. And he says the reason behind this is that the tasting being a celebrity, or if we would put it in English as something as the satisfaction of being a celebrity or of being famous, is much more loved by the self than money. And he quotes Sayyidina Sufyan al-Thawri when he says that fitnatul hadith, the challenge or the turbulation or the risk of being a muhaddith, being a narrator of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, this kind of fitna is stronger than the fitna, or is much more dangerous than the fitna of al-ahl, wal-mal, wal-walad. That it's very luring to become a muhaddith. And if you put the words of Sayyidina Sufyan al-Thawri back then in context, al-muhaddith had what we call glory back then. Because you're talking at a time where the dissemination and the narration of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ was regarded in a very high regard. And muhaddith was somebody that people very much looked up to. So the fact that Sayyidina Sufyan al-Thawri is saying that, look, being a muhaddith, you're in a fitna already by being a muhaddith. And this fitna is much stronger than looking to gain wealth or to gain to raise a family, and because also raising a family is somewhat risky in itself. It's not something that is a mere benefit. There is a risk, there is a challenge in raising a family. Okay, and Imam Al-Ghazali iterates in this point whether using the narrations from the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim. And then he goes to say that another indicator of alim al-akhirah is that he's very much concerned about the sciences, or about the knowledge that helps him practice, that helps him on his path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that helps him on his journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All the sciences or all the disciplines that are only concerned with debate, only concerned with who's right and who's wrong, proving who's right and who's wrong in forms of debate or in forms of arguments, alim al-akhirah is not really concerned about these issues, even if they do indulge in these things. But this is not their main concern, this is not their main worry. They would actually, even if they indulge into it, or if they fall into some kind of debate or an argument, it's for the sake of al-akhirah, but they don't find it as an objective, they don't find it as something that they're looking forward to argue, or they're looking forward to hold a debate, or they're looking forward to be involved in a public discussion. But rather, they're very much concerned about the knowledge that they can put to work, knowledge that would make them understand their path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala much better and much deeper. And he gives an interesting metaphor. He says that the person who is not really interested about the knowledge that he or she can put to work, the person who's not interested about the application of knowledge or the implementation of knowledge, the person who's not worried or concerned about how they will be steadfast on the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, those people are like somebody who is ill, who's like a patient, who's looking for a cure, looking to be healed, looking to be treated by a doctor, by a physician. And once they find a physician, all that they ask about is the chemical components of certain medications, and all perhaps the possibility of any kind of contradiction between medications, and the intricate differences between one medicine and another, and one type of procedure and another, and a style of treatment that is different, and the comparison between hospitals according to the equipments that are available or not, and from which type of school of thought in medicine are you as a doctor, and so forth and so on. So the person is ill, the person is sick, he's a patient or she's a patient, and they're looking for a treatment, and instead they get into arguments about all the technical details of being a doctor, of being a physician, all the options and alternatives in treatment and all these things, and yet they're not taking the medicine. and yet they're not being observed by the doctor as a patient, and they're not being treated, they're not receiving any kind of treatment, they're not attending any kind of procedure, and all they're doing is they're discussing issues, they're arguing about the medication. He says, so that person, he says, this is mahdus safa, this is just mere stupidity. If the person is doing that, and all that the person is doing is discussing things and not being treated. So again, he says, out of this metaphor, ulama al-akhirah are those who are looking for the treatment. They see themselves as patients looking for treatment, not as people who are interested into kalam, just talking. Another indicator that Imam Al-Ghazali mentions, he says that this person is usually inclined to what? To abstaining from too much food, too much clothing, too much eloquent style. So pretty much he's saying that ulama al-akhirah are those who are modest, those who are moderate, those who are sensible when it comes to impermissible things. Not that it's permissible that a person should be so indulged into it. Yes, it is permissible, but you have to be modest about it. You have to be moderate in your intakes, so to speak, of these permissible things. So he's saying that ulama al-akhirah are very much inclined for modesty, being moderate and sensible. However, what Imam Al-Ghazali discusses in this, because see, Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam, rahimahullah ta'ala, was a great Shafi'i scholar. He's a student of Imam Al-Amidi. Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam talks about how it became necessary at his time that scholars should be dressed in eloquent clothing and should have their own style of clothing. Because of the social tensions, because of the social dynamics that changed. Back then, during the times of Imam Al-Ghazali and before, people used to look up to those who are not really eloquently dressed, but rather the person who's modest, the person who's moderate, the person who's sensible in his lifestyle was seen as something positive. People would look up to that person. But then, things changed. And perhaps this is something that Imam Al-Ghazali was worried about, that scholars, when they enter into this kind of worldly life, people would then shift their view of scholars. And the more person would look, would have a fancy style or something of that sort, people would look up to him, and then they would look down on those who are modest and those who are moderate in their clothing and in their acts and their lifestyle and so on and so forth. So Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam was talking about something that already happened. People are only look up to those who are very well dressed, those who look like scholars, have a scholar type of look. All in all, what Imam Al-Ghazali is trying to say in here is that, even if we consider, of course, Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam was after Imam Al-Ghazali, but what I'm trying to say is that the idea, the concept that was introduced by Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam, rahimahullah, was perhaps in the mind of Imam Al-Ghazali. So he's not saying that the person is not supposed to be well dressed, or that scholars should not have their own dress code, but rather what he's saying is that don't be involved in these issues too much. Al-Ghazali also talks about the idea of being a scholar of al-akhirah and at the same time be involved with political regimes, so to speak. And the norm for the Sufis, or for the Sufi scholars, that the person should be, and actually Sayyidina Abdul Wahab Sha'rani radiallahu ta'ala anhu has a book about this, about the stance of the Sufi scholars towards being involved with what they call a sultan, being involved with political regimes, and how they should keep a distance from being politically involved. So this is the norm, all right? And whoever is involved in something like that is against the norm. I'm not necessarily saying that this person is wrong, even though all the statements by the scholars are very much, there are severe warnings about the person who would be involved in these things. But also from experience, even though it's rare, but it does happen, that certain scholars, when they become involved with certain political regimes, that would help the state altogether. Actually, the teacher of Imam Al-Ghazali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Imam al-Haramain Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, was pretty much involved with Nizam al-Mulk, the great minister of his time. And he was one of the consultants of Nizam al-Mulk. So, we're not saying that this something is completely prohibited, but there are severe wordings. I don't know about the religious verdict, what is permissible, what is not permissible, but what is a fact is that there are a large amount of texts, quotations, statements by the scholars, whether actually they're Sufi or not Sufi, warning the scholars from being too much close to political regimes and to governors and so on and so forth. But again, from experience, there is a rare incident where that was somewhat fruitful. What I'm trying to get at, if the person is involved himself, or is a follower of those who are involved, should be aware of something. That whatever that person is doing is against the norm, whether it's right or wrong. Just put that right or wrong aside. It could be right for that person. It could be permissible for that person in particular. It could be useful for that person in particular. Fine. That doesn't make it the norm. And that doesn't make these statements vanish, evaporate. But rather these statements still hold. So if that person is an exception and you're a follower of that person, be aware that you are following an exception. Don't turn it into the norm. So if you find everybody else is trying to stick to the norm, is trying to stick to the mainstream, don't start accusing them of attacking the person or not being aware of what is good and what is wrong. They're just trying to be in the mainstream, follow the norm follow the code of ethics that has been shared generation after generation by the scholars of this ummah. That the scholars should not be too much involved, should not be always visiting and always being too close to those who are in power, those who are in authority. And they should be away from them as much as possible. Exceptions, if they become the general rule, then they're not exceptions anymore. Another indicator of the scholar of al-akhirah that this person does not find himself or herself pushed or urged to give out a religious verdict. So they usually abstain from giving a fatwa. They always try to be away from giving verdicts, especially when it comes, and this has been narrated by the companions and also by the pious predecessors, especially when it comes to issues that are related to divorce and marriage. And you find nowadays, especially after the fatwa sessions that they hold on television, which is really funny. You find a person answering questions when it comes to marriage and divorce, online or in television or on the phone, in a quick 5 minutes, 2 minutes talk. Oh, Sheikh, somebody I said so and so. So is she divorced or not? And you find the answer coming out really quick. This is an indicator, not that the person is necessarily is not only a scholar of ad-dunya, it is an indicator that that person is ignorant to begin with. And you find, and this is something, to be quite honest, has changed, and you can see that how now Egyptian scholars, certain Egyptian scholars from Darul Ifta, when they appear on television and they are asked about such questions, and sometimes these questions are being asked by the wives, not by the husbands, they refuse to answer them. Because in pretty much divorce, in principle, is something that is committed as an action, is something that is committed by the husband, not by the wife. So the person who should be asking, because they will ask him questions about his state when he said that word, what is the exact word, when did that happen, what happened previously, what happened after, what was your intentions, all these questions, he should answer them personally, not through a person who's already involved in that conflict, because that would create a conflict of interest as well. But before, this is the norm, this is what should be done. Before that, there were TV programs in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, where supposedly those who consider themselves shuyukh or something of that sort, whatever, they appear on television and they start getting questions about marriage and divorce, and they just give out verdicts like that. It's like a machine. One of my dear friends who used to study with Sheikh Ahmed Ifat, rahimahullah ta'ala, told me that he was once, after or before his lesson at Jamia Al-Azhar, when he was explaining Hashik al-Bajuri, a person asked him a question in marriage and divorce, so he stopped for about half an hour asking that person questions. After he finished in 5 minutes explaining what happened, and in giving out his question or posing his question to the Shaykh, the rest, the 25 minutes or almost a half an hour, it was just Sheikh Ahmed Ifat asking him questions, and it was almost, the person who narrated the story to me, he said it was almost like an interrogation. He asked a question like once and twice, and then he would ask other questions, and then he would come back again, ask a question that he previously asked before, to see if the person asking the question would change his answer or not. Because sometimes people will do that. They will try to cover up. So he was trying to make sure that the person asking him the question about divorce was not covering up something. So it was almost like he's interrogating him in questions. This is how it's supposed to be. So if the person putting himself in the position of a sheikh and getting a phone call from, and what is worse than that, you find a person calling, let's say from Algeria, all right? And then the person asking the question is an Egyptian who studied with Wahhabis, all right? And became supposedly a Hanbali, and he's not a Hanbali in reality. So he is a fake pseudo-Hanbali answering a person who lives in a Maliki society. This we call Egypt is Ak. You know what is Ak? Have you ever heard? I don't know how to translate that. Yeah, it's just a very bad problem. Ak is pretty much when you put like things that are really, really not related, put them all together and create something that is kind of utterly stupid. That is. So the ulama al-akhirah, they would look down on guessing when they give out fatwas. You find sometimes some people who are not from ulama al-akhirah, actually, ulama al-dunya, they feel pressured to answer questions. Every question they're asked, when they don't find an answer, it becomes a problem. It's like something bad happened. So they feel they're afraid of saying la adri, I don't know. They look down on saying la adri. They see it as something that is shameful to say la adri. On the other hand, ulama al-akhirah sees la adri as the best answer. I don't know. And ask somebody else. Another indicator that the person of ulama al-akhirah is very much concerned. He says, أكثر اهتمامه. His main concern is with the knowledge that is related with the self, knowledge of the heart, knowledge of the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, Imam Al-Ghazali says that the intricates of the heart, or the knowledge of the heart, the intricate knowledge of the heart and the works of the heart, being attentive to these issues and learning them, this is the core of wisdom. He says, on the other hand, books and academic studies would not lead to that. And this is almost an explicit statement by Imam Al-Ghazali that wisdom is not in books, not in academic books. It's not. It's something that you cannot find in texts. But only by action, only by worship, only by rituals, only by dhikr. And this is a, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but this is one of the main arguments between theologians and Sufis. You see, Sufis see that worship is a cause for knowledge. That you can seek knowledge by worship. The more you do dhikr, the better you will understand. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ وَاعْبُدُ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينُ. Yaqeen is what? Yaqeen is certitude. Certitude in knowledge. How do you reach that? وَاعْبُدُ رَبَّكَ. Worship your Lord, and until you reach certitude. Certitude in knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So certitude becomes like a level of knowledge. How is that level attained? By your continuous worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, as-Sada Sufiya, you see that worship, acts of worship, are a source, or are a cause of knowledge, of better understanding, of comprehension of the self and of the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unlike theologians would see that as the rational reasoning, they would uphold rational reasoning to be the premium type of, or as a premium source in seeking knowledge or in knowing. In epistemology, they would find that rational reasoning, intellectual reasoning, is the primary source of knowing whatever is not known.
So is Imam Ghazali saying that wisdom is a gift from God?
Is saying that? No, I did not answer your question. Go ahead.
Imam Ghazali saying that wisdom is a gift from God.
What is a gift?
The wisdom.
Wisdom is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, he is saying that, but he's saying also that a person could reach that wisdom by going into that tariqul akhirah, and then that wisdom is gifted or granted then. Did I answer your question? I don't know. Go ahead, sir.
Should knowledge of the sciences or theology itself versus worship or ibadah, should that be balanced? Or because in the Mizan al-Amal on the other hand, Imam Al-Ghazali chastises the Sufis for focusing solely on worship and not being involved in the sciences itself or the rational sciences.
True, and for this reason, the coming section, the 7th section, Imam Al-Ghazali talks about the intellect, al-aql, and he discusses how it has been said that Sufis, they look down on al-aql. Should it be balanced? I wouldn't say it can be balanced, but rather what Imam Ghazali is saying that whatever knowledge that comes out of ibadah would not come out from academic studies. But if you mean balance in the sense that Sufis would develop the ability to present their ideas to theologians or present their ideas to jurists, then they would require that. And this is obvious whether in the works of Imam Ghazali or in the later works, for example, an example to this, Sidi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi presented his ideas. But then you would find the scholars after Sidi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, like Sadr al-Din al-Qawnawi and Al-Allam al-Fanai, and all those who came after Sidi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, Shaykh Dawood al-Qaysari radiallahu ta'ala anhu, all of them started presenting the ideas of Sidi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi in a form of, in a structure similar to the books of theology and books of falsafa. They would even use terminologies that are very similar to the terminologies of falasifa or theologians. So perhaps in that sense, yes, Sufis would then need to balance out between worship and sciences in that sense. And in another sense, that the Sufi is supposed to worship correctly. And this is why you find, for example, certain jurists were only concerned about writing treaties and manuals for the Sufis. Like even the manuals that were written later on, like Al-Murshid al-Mu'in, for example, for the Malikis. You would find how they start with, Sayyidina Aisha would start with an intro that has the ideas of belief, and then the al-ibadat, and then after that you would the third part of Al-Murshid al-Mu'in is in Sufism, and you find same thing that happened with Zubayd ibn Raslan, for example, with the Shafi'is. So that idea became. There was also a book by Ibn Hajar al-Haythami that involved 3 sciences, that involved creed, usul fiqh, and tasawwuf. I just can't remember the name of the book right now. So the idea is that even al-mutakhirun, the late scholars, did write in, they would incorporate Sufism with principles of jurisprudence and i'tiqad, or any kind of other forms or other structures. But the problem in this, that people would start seeing Sufism as just an academic subject. This is just a requirement out of the core curriculum for my graduation. Because some of especially the modern day Ash'aris, who are very much involved in theology, they would see Sufism as al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya, as Ihya Ulumuddin, as reading Sheikh Zarruq, and that's it. Some of them would see that Sidi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi is not a Muslim, but they would not say so. Some of the Ash'aris do, they're almost like it's like a phenomenon of being a Wahhabi / Ash'ari, so to speak, but they would not really say that. There was just a couple days ago, an Ash'ari sheikh, who's was a student of a famous sheikh, wrote something, a post on a very popular Ash'ari page or group on Facebook about how that al-istighatha, seeking refuge from the Prophet ﷺ, is haram, is impermissible. Which is almost, not almost, it is a Wahhabi stance in that regard. And how the attendance of the Prophet ﷺ to al-Mawlid is a myth, which is something that has been agreed upon in Sufi traditions. And they are Ash'aris at the same time. You find somebody who would come and write something that, if that, they would say, for example, that Sufi saint or that Sufi master, and the case was Sidi Abdul-Aziz al-Dabbagh, is not a saint, is not a wali. And whoever believes he is a wali is stupid. You find Ash'aris saying these things, which is really... Another person who claims to be a Sufi Ash'ari would say, I don't believe that Sidi Abul Hasan al-Shadili saw the mountain moving. Well, you don't believe, that's up to you. So the issue is that balancing wouldn't. I'm fine with this idea or this notion of balancing, and I do understand where you're coming from also when we talk about what Imam Al-Ghazali said in Mizan al-Amal. And perhaps because of what he said in Mizan al-Amal, as I mentioned, you find scholars like Sheikh Zarruq, for example, would have a Sufi presence, but at the same time has a very strong fiqh presence. Even he has put the rules or the fundamentals of tasawwuf in a form or in a model of fiqh or usul fiqh rules, so to speak, al-qawa'id al-tasawwuf. Even some Sufis would, find a problem in tadawwuq, the works, some of the works of Sheikh Zarruq, because they're very systemized, and they're more, let's say, they're more interested in what is called al-ibara. But Sheikh Zarruq would use texts that are very much have a logical structure in their words. So to summarize this, a balance would happen that a Sufi is supposed to worship correctly, regardless if he got that knowledge from studying fiqh or just being practically taught by a faqih. Just attending what is called in Mauritania muhadir, or attending what has been popular in Egypt like kutab, attending something like that, observing somebody, a Shafi'i sheikh, or a Maliki sheikh, or a Hanbali, or a Hanafi sheikh, applying the acts of worship, and practicing fiqh according to that madhab, this is fine for the Sufi. He's not really necessitated to study books and to memorize and things of that sort. So then, what you brought out is correct, that some Sufis, I do have to say that, some Sufis don't really pay attention to what is permissible, what is not permissible when it comes to certain acts of worship. And Sheikh Abdul Sha'rani tried to, when he wrote Al-Mizan and he wrote other works, he was trying to bring issues of jurisprudence forward in a form that the Sufis can find familiar and find easy to study. So in this regard, a balance can be attained according to this part. But on the other hand, turning Sufism into a subject, and then we can say we can balance out. In other words, I can study fiqh, and I study kalam, I can also study Sufism. Sufism in reality is not something you study. It's something you practice and you experience. But talking about Sufism is something that people can study. Discussing, describing, perhaps narrating Sufism can be an area of study. But the actual Sufism is not an academic subject. And the conclusion of this, see, you can find a non-Muslim faqih. You can find a non-Muslim who is more knowledgeable in whatever madhab of Islam more than Muslims themselves. You can find a non-Muslim usuli. And in the case of a non-Muslim faqih, we are not permitted to ask that faqih for fatwa from a Sharia standpoint. But other than that, that person could be much or more knowledgeable than Muslims. And you find in the modern writings of scholars from the West who study academic texts of Muslim intellectual thought, you find their works are much more deeper than whatever comes out from the Arabic universities. From the Arab universities, the amount of work, the depth of work is enormous, and yet you don't find that in the Arab world. But see, this is when it comes to usul, and this is when it comes to fiqh. It might even be when it comes to hadith, it might be when it comes to falsafa and mantiq and so on and so forth. And it'll also be the case when it comes to Sufism, when they talk about Sufism. Fine? But at the end of the day, practicing Sufism cannot be done by anybody but a Muslim. Practicing Sufism. Because at the end of the day, the Shaykh does not take you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by having you read a book. Actually, in some Sufi orders, the Shaykh takes you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by his heart, what is called tawajjuh. That the Shaykh is attentive to the murid. And by being attentive to the murid, that murid reaches higher levels by only the Shaykh being attentive to the murid. So in this regard, it's not by reading al-hikam, it's not by reading Ihya Ulumuddin that you become a Sufi. You can know about Sufism from al-hikam perhaps. You can read about Sufism in Ihya Ulumuddin. But at the end of the day, it is that experience of Sufism is what brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And see, even here, in that part where we're discussing the words of Imam Al-Ghazali, he's saying that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants those who are so much involved in dhikr and remembrance. And he says, al-mutajarrideen li-dhikr, he means that those who are taking dhikr as their primary act. He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them knowledge of verses and of a hadith that if you open the exegesis, the tafsir, if you open books of tafsir, you would not find what has been granted to them of wisdom and knowledge, and that would answer your question. What is granted to them, you would not find in books of explanations of hadith or books of tafsir. And later on, these things that they were granted, this kind of information, knowledge, understanding, it has been written down later on. And now people can find what is called Tafsir al-Ishari, perhaps, and the Sufi tafsir. And what you find in these books, you would not find in any other kind of books of tafsir. I thought for a long period of time that this has been done only to the book, in the case of the Quran al-Kareem, where Sufis would write books of tafsir that would involve the wisdoms that they have understood from their acts of worship, and they would incorporate these gems, perhaps, they would incorporate these gems in their books. I thought that for a long period of time, I thought that was not been the case when it comes to the hadith, that nobody has written something in this regard. Yes, it has been discussed, mentioned in the books of Sufism, but perhaps it was not written like a single book written for the sake of writing or recording the wisdoms of the Sufis when it comes to reading the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And then I found a book called the Ara'isul Hadith by Rusdahan Baqri. It's printed in Persian. And that book, Ara'isul Hadith, if I'm not mistaken in the title, is pretty much a Sufi explanation of al-Hadith. And I believe also Mawlana Sadruddin al-Qawnawi has done something similar, has collected 40 Hadith and has given explanation of these 40 Hadith as well. So it would be interesting if somebody would trace the works, the Sufi works when it comes to Hadith. it's popular. The works of Sufis, when it comes to tafsir, they're popular. But when it comes to hadith, it's not as popular. So this is an idea of a project if somebody's interested in that. And then he says another indicator is that the Sufi, is that the Alim al-Akhirah, the scholar of al-Akhirah, is very much concerned about the idea or about the concept of certitude, al-yaqeen. And here Imam Al-Ghazali says, you might ask, what is al-yaqeen? And then he says, and also he says, you might ask, what do I mean by strong certitude and weak certitude? Because when you think about the concept, about the word of certitude, some people might think this is not a concept that we can apply strength to it. Certitude is in itself strong. So when you say a strong certitude, how is that? So he's saying, you might ask, what do I mean by a strong certitude and what do I mean by a weak certitude? So he explains that al-yaqeen is a word, is a common word that is used by two types of, or by two groups. The first group are the theologians, and they would use the word certitude. The meaning or the definition of certitude for the theologians is the absence of doubt. عدم الشك. And he says that the absence of doubt has 4 levels. Or actually, I apologize, not the absence of doubt, but the belief has 4 levels. Believing in something has 4 levels. He says the first case is that a person would believe in something and at the same time has an inclination not to believe in it. In other words, it's a 50-50 chance. And somewhat believes in that tenet, believe in that article of faith, or not believe in it. So it's a 50-50 case. And this is what he describes as doubt. See, doubt is not what people think. People sometimes think that doubt is that I am almost sure. This is not doubt. This is one. Doubt is going back and forth between 2 opposing beliefs. It's a yes or a no. And the person is going back and forth between yes and no. This is doubt. So this is the first level of belief. And then the second level of belief, he says, when the self is more inclined towards one of those 2. But yet, there is a possibility for the self, where the self sees a possibility to judge otherwise. So it is inclined for one of the 2, but yet it sees a possibility that things could turn around. So this is the second level of belief. And then he says the third level of belief is that when the self does believe in something, for the most part, and he says this is a belief that is very close to certitude. And he says that this is the belief of the mass public, or al-awam, the general masses, when it comes to, for example, religious verdicts and things of that sort. They're very close to certitude. And then the fourth level, he sees this is the al-ma'rifatul haqiqiyya, the real knowledge that the person reaches by the most strong or the strongest proof possible. And he says this is called certitude. All of this type of hierarchy or this type of 4 levels, this is according to theologians that Imam Al-Ghazali is explaining. He says the second usage of certitude. So now, certitude for theologians is the 4th level of belief. Okay? It's a belief where, in a state of belief where there is a complete absence of doubt. Alright? There's no 1 chance or 5% chance of doubt whatsoever. So this is one kind of usage of the word yaqeen. And then another usage of the word yaqeen is, he says this is the nomenclature of the jurists and the Sufis. In other words, this is when Sufis and fuqaha would use the word yaqeen, this is what they would mean. That they don't look, they're not attentive to the idea of shak. See, the theologians were worried about the level of doubt in comparison to the level of belief. He says, when it comes to al-fuqaha, when it comes to Sufis, it's not a matter of do I believe or not. It's not a matter of belief against doubt. It's a matter of how much the heart is inserted in that belief, regardless of whatever is opposite. They're not attentive, they're not concerned about doubt. The person's level of belief is 60% and his level of doubt is 40%. The fuqaha, according to Imam Al-Ghazali, and the Sufis are not really concerned about this type of belief versus something else, but rather the immersion of the heart in that belief. How the heart is how the belief is all over the heart, so to speak. And he gives an example. He says, some people, we would say that they have weak certitude in death. And what we mean by that, they believe that death is something that will eventually happen, no matter what. And yet, you find scholars would say, that person has a weak yaqeen, has a weak certitude in death. In other words, he is not concerned, not attentive, his heart is not aware, is not continuously aware that death is a fact. Not that they don't believe in death, in terms of their theological belief, but rather by their actions, that the awareness of their heart reflects the Sufi certitude, so to speak. And he quotes those who say, "ما رأيت يقينا لا شك فيه أشبه بشك لا يقين فيه من الموت." In other words, what he's saying is this: they say that we haven't seen a certitude that has no doubt, like a doubt that has no certitude. Again, we haven't seen a certitude without a doubt, similar to a doubt without certitude, but death. Death, when it comes to certitude of logic, a logical certitude, people are completely certain that death is inevitable. But at the same time, they're completely unaware of death. They don't think of it. It's totally out of their mind. They're not attentive to that reality to the point where it's almost they're not certain of its existence at all. All right. So that would show us that how certitude would mean something in terms of theology, and then it would mean something else in terms of Sufism.
Can you repeat that line?
Okay. So they say we haven't seen a certitude without a doubt that is like a doubt without certitude, and it's death. So then Imam Al-Ghazali says, certitude in that term, in that definition, according to that definition, certitude would then be strong or weak. Because certitude, when it comes to theology, cannot be strong or weak. Because it is the highest level of belief, the fourth level of belief. But when it comes to the notions of Sufism, the word yaqeen could then be strong or weak. Because Sufis find knowledge as experiencing reality, not that it is understanding reality. ليس الخبر كالمعاينة. Hearing about something is not like seeing it. Alright? So, knowing about death is something, and experiencing death is something else, right? So, Sufis want to reach, by the rituals, the knowledge of the person who's experiencing death without experiencing death. They want to reach the knowledge of seeing the Prophet ﷺ without seeing the Prophet ﷺ physically. Those who study deen, religion, from an academic standpoint, they want to understand what it is like to see the Prophet ﷺ. Not to experience that, but how is it like? Describe it. So they're describing things but not experiencing them. They would just define death. See, would be a theological point of view. Define the attribute of power. Define the attribute of will. Define the attribute of knowledge. They are defining. That's why they're called mutakallimun. They define kalam. And yet the Sufis are described as al-arifu billah. Sayyid Shaykh al-Jurjani, in his in the biography of his in book Rashhat wa Ayn al-Hayat, which is a Naqshbandi a book of biographies, because Sayyid Shaykh al-Jurjani was a Naqshbandi. Many people don't know that. Sharih al-Mawaqif fi Ilm al-Kalam was a Naqshbandi and was a believer in Sidi Muhyiddin al-Arabi. So the author quotes him saying, ما عرفت الله. I did not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the person who wrote the most popular explanation of book in Ilm al-Kalam, Al-Mawaqif fi Ilm al-Kalam. If we ever say the explanation of Al-Mawaqif, there is no other explanation but the explanation of Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani. This is a main text that has been used to graduate scholars in Ilm al-Kalam in the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. And yet he says, مَا عَرَفْتُ اللَّهِ. I did not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until I became a follower of Al-Khawaja Alauddin al-Attar, who's a Naqshbandi master. I did not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala حتى اتصلت بصحبة Al-Khawaja Alauddin al-Attar قدس الله سره. These were the words that were mentioned in his biography in Rashhat wa Ayn al-Kalam, according to him. Because the narrator said, I heard him saying more than once. سَمِعْتُهُ مِرَارًا. So, that type of knowledge, or that type of certitude, is different than the type of certitude that the logicians or the theologians would discuss. And according to this definition then, that type of certitude could be weak, or it could be strong. Okay. So he's saying that ulama al-akhirah would be guess what? Would be interested in which type of certitude? He's saying that ulama al-akhirah will be interested in the other type of certitude. And I want you to know something. See, when scholars, even theologians, when they wanted to define al-Iman, they did not define it as a tasdeeq. Because tasdeeq is mere belief. But they said at-tasdeeq ma'a al-id'an, which is belief and then being committed to that belief or submission to that belief. So it's not mere belief, it's a belief with submission. In other words, you could find that somebody would logically believe in something, but yet would reject it. He sees it, it's obvious, but yet they don't have the desire or urge to say, I believe, or rather be in their own selves, find a submission to that belief. So for this reason, theologians said that the definition of al-iman, of faith, a person is a believer not when he believes, but rather when he submits to that belief. The Jews of the time of the Prophet ﷺ believed that he's a prophet. They had a proof. And they made sure that that proof is there. And they believed in that. And then they said, no, but we will not submit to him. So you would find a belief without submission. So it's not considered to be having faith in something. So that is why then that certitude of the Sufis is much more important than, I'm not downgrading the theological aspect. And Al-Imam Salhindi, in Al-Maktubat, gives a very interesting, he says if somebody has what they call in Arabic as-safra, if somebody is ill, and his illness is that they cannot taste sugar, they cannot find the sweetness of sugar. Okay? This is their illness. So if you prove to them, logically, that sugar is sweet, but every time they taste it, they find it bitter, they might believe you that in reality it is sweet. But you cannot, by the methods of logic, you cannot make their tongue taste or experience that sweet flavor. Right? So, and he's using this example to say this is the difference between a theologian and a Sufi master. At-tazkiyah is that process that would turn the ill heart, the sick heart, into finding the acts of worship as certitude. Because he says that the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the existence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his prophethood, the ahkam al-shar'iyyah, all of these, in principle, don't require proofs. They're so obvious, like 1 + 1 = 2. But we need proofs because of the obstacles between our hearts and reaching that truth. Okay. Some of the indicators that Imam Al-Ghazali are very close to others. So I've mentioned the indicators that perhaps don't overlap. He did state another indicator that Alim al-Akhirah is not primarily dependent on what is in books. Again, you find this notion is brought up by Imam Ghazali over and over and over again. Okay. Talks about the idea of innovations. All right. This section I want to conclude with a quote that Imam Ghazali radiallahu ta'ala anhu mentions according to Sahl Tustari radiallahu anhu. Says, إن من أعظم المعاصي الجهل بالجهل. One of the most grave sin is being ignorant about ignorance. إن من أعظم المعاصي الجهل بالجهل. Yeah, سهل تستري. So what is... See, this has many applications. On one hand, you could use this for academic knowledge. It would be applicable. Such quotes, it would be applicable. And I wouldn't, perhaps he did not primarily, that was not his intention to say that people should be aware about the importance of knowledge, academic knowledge. Perhaps this was not his intention, but still, what he's saying does apply in that realm or that scope of academic knowledge and disciplines and sciences and so on and so forth. But for his, foremost intention by saying this, and according to the context that Imam Al-Ghazali has narrated this quote in, is that he's saying that when people don't consider what is ignorance not knowing definitions, or is ignorance not being able to taste what is it like to pray with khushu'? What is it like, to taste the wisdoms of why certain actions are ordained or are mandated, and why other actions are recommended, and why this is haram, and why this is makruh, and so on and so forth. Being able to experience the taste of these things. Because we could be ignorant of such tastes, of such flavors. We could be ignorant of such experiences. So then it will be a grave sin that we become ignorant about our ignorance of these issues. And I guess this quote by Sahel al-Tustari radiallahu ta'ala anhu summarizes what Imam Al-Ghazali was trying to say in that whole book. He pretty much wrote that book of knowledge for the sake of, lifting the ignorance of ignorance. And in other words, if you come out of the book of knowledge understanding your ignorance, you have achieved its purpose. This is pretty much the objective of that book. As a student of knowledge, as a student of Sharia, what are you ignorant about? This is pretty much the main purpose, main objective of Imam Al-Ghazali. Okay, in this remaining 7 minutes, the 7th section, Imam Al-Ghazali discusses the idea of intellect and the importance of the intellect. He starts again, I guess you guys are now aware of the methodology of Imam Al-Ghazali. He starts with talking about the virtues of the intellect, sharaf al-aql. And we mentioned before how the Muslim discourse, when they talk about virtues, they don't necessarily talk about utility, but rather when they talk about the importance of things, they don't necessarily talk about their utility, but rather they talk about their nobility, their virtue. And we mentioned early on in the course how nowadays we are missing an ethical discourse within our Muslim communities that hold up the idea of virtues up high. But whenever we try to recommend something, we usually talk about it in terms of utility, in terms of means to an end. But we don't talk about the nobility of things, the virtue of things, what is known as fadl al-shay or sharaf al-shay, the nobility or the virtue. Okay. And Imam Al-Ghazali starts by saying, he's saying that I don't really need to talk about the nobility of al-aql, because we have already talked about knowledge and the nobility of knowledge and the glory of knowledge, and al-aql is the vessel of knowledge. So pretty much it's obvious, its importance and its virtue is pretty much obvious. But he does do that same methodology of mentioning the athar, or mentioning the text from the Prophet ﷺ or from the Sahaba about the importance of al-aql. And then he moves on to talk about bayanu haqiqat al-aqli wa aqsamihi. He talks about the different what is, first, what is al-aql, what is the intellect, and then what are the types of the intellect? Okay, and then he says that the word intellect, or that the word aql, is one word, but it's used for 4 different meanings. Just like the word ayn in Arabic language could be used for the eye, but also could be used for the well. Okay? Aynun, almost like a well. So what he's saying is that the word aql, or intellect, is similar to the word ayn in that sense. And see that each one of these definitions, each one of these usages don't overlap. Each one of them is kind of different. He says the first one is that aql is used for the capacity that distinguish humans from the rest of animals. And it is pretty much the capacity that allowed mankind, or humans, to develop what he calls al-ma'rifa al-nazariyya. Al-ma'rifa al-nazariyya is pretty much theoretical knowledge. See, a cat does not have theoretical knowledge. It does have practical knowledge, knows how to go about living in this world. But yet, they don't write books of, eating fish for dummies or something like that. That was cheesy, I'm sorry. But anyway. Anyways, they don't have this idea of theoretical knowledge. What is called the intellectual capacity of humans, you find in books of falsafa, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ibn Sina, or a scholar from the Ibn Sina's tradition has mentioned how that one of the differences of that capacity, or capacity of humans, the thinking in humans, how it's different than the rest of animals. For example, when it comes to memory, both humans and the rest of animals, both of them do have exercised this capacity of memory and remembering things. But humans are different in a sense that we can try to remember something that we already forgot. But animals, they're saying, they don't try to remember. If they forgot something, it's done. They don't try to remember something. Okay? But this idea that we use tricks, or this is what they call al-hila. We try to use different methods in order to remember something that we already forgot. Another issue is that we do something that is what we call analysis. An analysis in Arabic would be 2 things. Would actually be what is called tajreed. To analyze is to do what is called tajreed. Tajreed is that when you see examples, individual examples of things, you analyze them to extract a universal, a general idea. Alright, so when I see, for example, red in a red ball, and then a red jacket, and then a red bag, and then a red wall, and then a red brick. So people come out with the concept of the red color. And then when people start seeing that this is apparent also in orange and in green and in blue, so they come up with the idea of color. Okay, so they keep going up in levels, seeing examples of things, individual examples, and then they extract commonalities, and they draw out of these commonalities a universal general rule, or what is called a universal, and they move up until the top universal is al-wujud, existence. Yes.
Excuse me if this
No.
is drifting off from the topic.
No, sorry.
But you mentioned of the particulars leading to the universals. Iqbal, in his reconstruction of religious thought, he says that the epistemology of the Quran, from the epistemology you can draw the scientific method or the methods of inductive reasoning. Is this something that's from the Quran, or is this innate? Because I've seen in Aristotelian thought, the inductive method is present there. But now Iqbal is arguing to say that this is solely from the Quran and this is the epistemology of the Quran. And now you're mentioning this as something that is innate to us.
Okay. Well, I could say that the existence of that type of epistemological phenomenon, the Quran addresses this reality as something that is intrinsic or existent in human beings. And this is something that Ibn Khaldun would call al-fiqh al-tabi'i, which is natural thought, that people do practice, not because they studied it in books or perhaps they did not experience something like Aristotelian logic. But Aristotelian logic, in reality, is pretty much a systemization of that al-fiqh al-tabi'i. In other words, he used a human intellect as a phenomenon to be studied in logic. Pretty much just like how scientists of physics or chemistry saw that chemistry is a phenomenon. And chemistry, the discipline, became the academic science to study that reality, which is chemicals. Physics, same thing. Biology, same thing. So logic would be, in that sense, it's like this. Every reality that is existent has a parallel discipline that sort of discusses that reality or phenomenon in a standardized form. So logic would be a standardization of that natural phenomena, which is induction, perhaps. The existence of Aristotelian thought is present in the Muslim tradition when it comes to books. And no matter how much we try to push away that we don't follow the Greeks in that sense, it is, open books of usul fiqh, you find Aristotle. Open books of fiqh, you find Aristotle. And that is normal, because when it comes to academia, we took from the Greeks, and then we gave to the Europeans, and then the Europeans took from us, and it goes on and so on. Because for many years, because of, again, and this is my own point of view, because of the Salafi movement and because of other reasons as well, people began to say, we began to say that Europeans, the Western discourse, the Western intellectual thought, they steal from us. They stole works of Avicenna. They stole works of Ibn Rushd. They did not steal anything. It's not like they plagiarized. It's not like they took the books of Ibn Sina and they wrote something, somebody's, some other name on it. But the Al-Qanun by Ibn Sina was existent in the libraries of Oxford as a reference for medical students. They did not say that this was wrote by John, Nash. They did not write something like that, but it was written Avicenna. It is a translation in Latin. Yes, sir.
What about the lack of merit of the Arab legacy?
The lack of merit?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
As in, they don't merit the Arab tradition. They don't merit the contribution that the Muslims gave to actual thought.
Okay, fine. I do grant this. You could find this the attribution of Muslim legacy. They don't write about the contributions. This is part of the European history where they don't talk about it as much. I do agree now. This is granted, but the idea that they stole, they might hide that they were benefited by these contributions. Fine, but the idea that they stole it in the sense that they plagiarized, that was not the case. Maybe but there's something though. Even in the contemporary Western world, they don't even glorify the contribution of the Aristotelian philosophy to the Western discourse altogether. I mean, they look down on Aristotle, they look down on metaphysics, they look down on philosophy and all that has been now embraced and celebrated, which is astronomy, physics, all the empirical sciences, and they look down on philosophy altogether. And one might argue that they look down on Islamic contribution not because it's Islamic, but because they see it as Aristotelian. One might say that conclusion, because when you see all the contributions that were taken from the Muslim tradition and the Muslim legacy, but somewhat, it is pretty much a branch or an offshoot of an Aristotelian tradition as well. Okay. So yes, the first capacity was the theoretical thinking. Not the first capacity, this is the first definition of the intellect, al-aql. So al-aql is used as a word to describe or to refer to the capacity that distinguishes human beings from the rest of animals, and that is the theoretical thinking. Al-aql is also what Imam Al-Ghazali, he did not use that word, al-awwaliyat, which is pretty much the intrinsic knowledge that grows out or that is developed in children when they become aware at the age of 4, 5, 6, 3, more or less, which is, the 2 is more than 1, Zayd is not Ubayd, things of, the primary, the fundamentals of knowledge. So this is used, the word aql is sometimes used for that basic knowledge that is intrinsic and develops in human beings when they are at a young age. And then the third usage for